So if we are given as demand centres, credit instruments, the principal product of commercial civilization, then can we look at redemptive history through a financial lens and then perhaps give credence to the Gnostic heresy, let's say, that the god, the Demerge, is an imposter for what would be the creator? So this will be a novel way of exploring what is modern life or the commercial paradigm, because if we are given as credit instruments, we have to connect our existential plight to the nature of what we're credited as human beings when we live under the auspices of a God that's independent of its creation. We become actuaries of a self-perpetuating system through what we're credited as consumers, let's say. So has a lot of people are familiar, especially within the West, how secularization immanentized a lot of theology of Christianity. And so what we're going to do is give credence to that claim, but explore it not in abstract concepts, but look at it from finance and ultimately from the principal product that this arc has legitimized. So when we're orientated towards life, are we redeeming ourselves? In finance, redemption relates to when an investor sells back an asset. So that can be, say, to redeem the funds for a particular investment vehicle. So that could be mutual funds, that could be bonds, that could be property. It could be done prior to its maturity, and there's all varying degrees. But essentially, you're cashing out by getting back your money. Obviously, you're redeeming the money that you've put in that vehicle. But how does that relate to the primary investment of the consumer? That is not only the principal product of a commercial paradigm, but is the principal asset. So we can say that we are an asset when ultimately a whole commercial paradigm is to generate a return on the investment of the human being into the asset of the consumer. So the way how that works is not through an external force, but literally the way how that we become actuaries of that process that we are essentially not aware of to the degree that we need to be when we don't ask the fundamental question of the way how we produce ourselves. And so therefore, in turn, what is the means of our production? How does that occur? Like, if you don't ask that fucking question, you're never going to look at life holistically. And so a buyer's journey is the journey that's sent for that redemption, all right, for the way how life is monetized. And so ultimately, if life is given as a buyer's journey, you have to have a vehicle on a buyer's journey. A person does not walk a buyer's journey. A consumer is produced in order to substantiate the totalizing claim that's made on life when it's given as such. And so we become actuaries of that. So an actuary in finance relates to establishing a risk profile in reference to, say, different investment vehicles to say cover future liabilities, and so in way to ensure that whatever investment is chosen, it's going to provide the return necessary in order to cover those liabilities through, say, the redemptions that occur. So if you're looking at it from insurance and, say, claims that's made on the business in order to pay out for insurance claims and whatnot. In reference to when we're given as consumers, obviously the actuary is different, all right? So the actuary works in a way that we don't recognize, because when life's given as a risk-free proposition, because we externalize through our marginal actions, we feel that the buyer's journey is orientated towards a redemptive arc that doesn't really risk anything. Because if you think, well, what can you risk when life's set as a buyer's journey and it's a totalizing claim? All you have to do is that you're given a formula for life. Obviously, you have to generate, or you have to accrue credit in order to disinhibit what you're credited as the principal product. So you're a demand center. The only thing that you can do is disinhibit what you're credited when you're given as that principal product. So the actuary works through the work-life balance. The consumer is transcendent to your life. So you get sold on purpose or on that balance. And so therefore you become an actuary of a system that necessitates you externalize what you're not credited. And so once again, if you're a consumer, you're passive, you're sent to essentially there to manage or be an actuary of a system that you don't question. Now, this is the issue. So when you don't question the genealogy of your redemption in reference to the claim that's made on it. And so you won't connect. What you do now as a compensatory exercise is that you're atoning for being born. And we talked about the nature of how that occurs when you legitimize the use of a credit you are not the originator of, because then you introduce a usurping principle. You cannot do justice to your birth. You do justice to the transition from the child to the adult and the way how that you have to become financially independent. So the financial independence is ultimately what you seek in order to secure your subdivided Eden. So if you look at it from that Gnostic understanding of the evil dommage, as it were, that is separate from its creation, has the pretense to be the creator, but is masquerading in its stead, let's say, then if you have the redemptive arc that's given in such a way that God is not, it's separate from creation. The way how that God is separate or independent from its creator, it's not immanent within the world, and so you have a separation between the creator and the created. Now that like separation or divide is what enables that you to become an actuary of a world, because if the world was created, then obviously you're here to simply to manage it. And so therefore what you're credited through that separation is that you're not a co-creator of the world. How can you be when obviously this absent God has monopolized the creativity? And so you become an actuary of what is created. So the spiritual disease that obviously redemptive history kind of immanentizes, you can't recognize it because you have to look at the arc and the progression so if we talk about secularization and the way how that gets immanentized within, say, the world to such a degree where finance becomes a very vehicle for that redemption. But then what's finance predicated upon? Well, it's predicated upon, if you're looking at commerce, that the economy produces a form of life to sanction the way how things are given. And so in turn, the redemption, or what occurs through finance or through economics or the whole apparatus of capture, ultimately is a form of maintenance. So what it does is it preserves a system that you become the actuary of, that necessitates you not questioning the origin of, say, a truth claim. Now, the truth claim has got nothing to do with whether or not, the Gnostics' understanding of God, of that God is true or false or whatever. It's got nothing to do with that. You've got to look at the principal claim now that's made on your life when time's given as a value, because then what you've done is, if you've immanentized a transcendental truth claim that time is a value, then you can connect it to the genealogy. But actually, when you become an actuary of a system, you've got to look at the primary truth claim that you legitimize, and ultimately your unavowed religiosity that you won't actually connect to say, a redemptive history, so that goes right back thousands of years ago. You just will not make the connection to it. And that's why, when you become an actuary of the world, so to preserve the way how the world's given, you practice a bad faith, because you don't question the truth claim as to whether or not time is a value or not. You will see time marginally, so that's through, once again, the marginality of your time, the distinction that we work when it's labour or leisure, but you've always got to look at what is transcendent to that, because the consumer, you as a person, is placed into the consumer vehicle, and your redemption is the way how the return on investment, when you're given as the principal product of civilization, is the way how life can be monetized. Rents, tolls, rentism is essentially what it's predicated upon. So you won't understand that your redemption occurs through your investment, right? But then simultaneously you discount what you cannot be credited when you are an actuary of a system. You don't question the principal truth claim, not of whether or not God is independent from its creation, but whether or not actually that truth claim of time is of value. Is that true, or is that a belief? Now, if it's a belief, obviously that's the nature of our unavowed religiosity. And so therefore then you can make the connection with, say, forms of religion that predate the imposition of that totalizing truth claim. That's why I say that modernity immanentizes our unavowed religiosity, and it's more virulent because people are simply not aware. You'll have the most secular people, the most a-religious people that will never actually stop to question whether or not the truth claim of time is of value, because they will see it through a prism and they cannot question the legitimacy of money, so the convention of money, what actually the existential status of it, and then ultimately the spirituality that underwrites it. You've got to think that if you're seeking your financial independence, you're seeking obviously a private Eden. You're actually just an impoverished model of the 7 days of creation, where on the seventh day God did jack shit. Right, so that God, if you're looking at it from that aspect, God on the seventh day is not a creative God, and so it's an economizing God. So we based our actions upon the same model, all right, for creativity, but in actual fact, is that God creative when obviously the God at the seventh day does nothing? Now you can look at it from the lines of the calendars, the Babylonian calendars, or even agriculture, where the way how they tend to leave, I think it was like fields fallow over 1 year. They used to rest. That was part of the process based upon the periodicity in reference to obviously what you can reap. So if that is the case, and it's questionable and we don't really need to explore it, you can understand our way of life is still very much agricultural. And so if you're looking at an agricultural God, well, is an agricultural God the primordial God, or is there a God that's fecund, that actually does not work off the basis of, say, the human development of agriculture, but this works off the planet life? All right, so you've got to look at that. That's a way that you could differentiate between it. But once again, that way of framing it is to a degree redundant, because once again you're looking at the principal truth claim of whether or not time is of value or not. But we know that actually through being consumers we outsource creativity. The world is a given, life is a buyer's journey, you don't question it. So through that immanentization, see, of that religiosity, or our unavowed religiosity, we don't question the nature of the way how that we produce the world. We don't acknowledge that, because life is given as a risk-free proposition. Creativity involves risking the self. All right, so how can we risk the self for our redemption when ultimately the orientation is just to seek a return on the investment of the consumer to externalize the world that we create for that redemptive path, that redemptive history, that small little redemptive history, as it were. And then in that turn, how can you do justice to being born? So look at life before agriculture, the imposition of agriculture, or an agricultural understanding when you relate it to, let's say, the 7 days of creation, and look at it from the aspect that your birth is the first birth should be the birth that is good enough. Why do you have to become twice born? Why do you have to create a way of life that legitimizes rentism of the constancy of agency when you use money as a tool for thinking? I've talked about this, the nature of what we discount when we use money. You are given as a demand center, and so therefore your agency it does not deviate over time. That's the only way that you can justify the money as a tool for thinking when you're looking at rates of return of different investment vehicles, because ultimately you are the investment, you are the asset. And so if you are the asset, well, what are you redeeming when you are the asset? It's just a monetized existence, and so therefore you can be sold on a subdivided Eden. So this also works on the basis of where are you? All right. So if you think of that orientation, if you cannot be spatially orientated towards the market for your time, you are literally beholden to a no place. All right. So what you've set in train that a buyer's journey is a redemptive kind of like arc, a redemptive, we could say, journey for the Eden. But when you collectivize buyer's journeys or no places, you create the inverse to that. And so modernity is the collectivization of unavowed utopianism, which is the inverse to what is the understanding of Eden. It is a dystopian view. It's a completely inverses. You see if you're orientated towards the Elysian fields, or however the way that you would mythologize that, but when you individualize it, but you collectivize it at the same time, then what you've got, that immanentization, when you cannot be spatially orientated to the market to your, when you cannot be spatially orientated to the market for your time, you create a dystopia. And so therefore, what is that? That's a hell realm. That is what you call the subterranean realm. And so in that way, you won't realize that you're beholden to no place, because you cannot temporalize creativity, because you're not credited it, because the God has basically monopolized that, because you're an actuary of a system that keeps you in the underworld. All right. And so therefore, look at it from that aspect. So therefore, what if you're in the underworld, well, what's given to you as your transcendence? That's social mobility. But the more wealth that you have, the more money that you have, you're not appropriating, or you're not orientated towards creativity, because, as I always talk about, when you have social mobility, you're always given as a demand center. So therefore, you can only be credited want. So you can disinhibit your want. So you can become potentially more perverse if you are that way inclined. It's obviously not. It's predicated upon the person. But in the context here, you can understand the way how that works, all right? Because through disinhibiting your want, you're still not credited creativity, because to be creative is to create a world with other people, co-creators, to be a co-creator. But how can you possibly co-create when you're an actuary of a system and your transcendence, so what you would aspire to, still means to say that you're in the underworld, and yet what you'll do, you'll have the pretense to be otherwise, because ultimately you're still you're still puerile, you're still a child, as far as, like, if we're looking at the eyes of God, let's say, well, where's the wisdom? So you can relate it back to when the parent endows a child with a buyer's journey set for life, that the parent does not endow any wisdom. They're not a wisdom keeper. They're an actuary of a system that externalizes thinking, the existential plight of where you are. Now, where are you when you cannot be spatially orientated to the market for your time? You're beholden to an unavowed utopianism, or a religiosity that you don't know that you're the adherent of, and yet you will think otherwise. So when we become actuaries of a system, and so we obviously are working on the distinction that we work on, so orientated towards leisure, so our private Eden, obviously we envisage that. So if we're given in no place, okay, and it's a death realm, or it's a subterranean realm, an underworld, let's say. All right, so what, the underworld, who lives in the underworld? Well, that's Pluto. All right, that's you're looking at a plutocracy. Why don't we recognize the fact that if life now, current life, is beholden to plutocracy, so that's the rule of wealth over people, well, where are you when you are in, where does Pluto rule? Rules in the underworld. So give context to that. How does that make sense? Then think of it through, because if you don't make the connection between where you are when you spiritualize time, all right, so once again, you talk about the way that you cannot be spatially orientated towards it, so there's no market outside you. It's a totalizing claim, and yet what does the plutocracy need? Well, it needs to monetize your existence to enrich themselves at your expense. All right, so therefore what happens, there's an opportunity cost. The opportunity cost is that you see life as a compensation. If you see life as a compensation, somebody else can monetize your aspirations. And they do that through the way here you have to be sold on place through your envisaging. So if you're beholden to an unavowed utopianism and you don't even know it, you don't know the mechanism of the way how that occurs, obviously you have lifestyle visions that feed you. that feed you the aspiration for life. That's what branding and marketing does. That's what advertising does. It's about entraining your vision, so therefore you can be entrained, so you can disregard, actually, where am I? I'm in a fucking hell realm, and I don't know that I am the architect of it, that I've immanentized this. Collectively, we all have. So if you understand that, then you work back. That there's no fucking cabal. It's like you're responsible. You're it. You stand in the underworld accused. And you're in, so if you're looking at the principal scene, let's say, all right, of this redemption, you're looking at, you are before, you're in the underworld. So and you are before a god. Who would that god be in the underworld? It would probably be Osiris. You're going to look at your life, your heart, and the feather of truth. Which one is it going to be? So if you are orientated towards aspiration and your heart becomes heavy because you aspire for life, right? But you cannot take your spirit, which is what represented, say, with the soul, that truth, and claim. So what would the truth be? Know where you are. You're being judged. You're never good enough. This is half the problem with this paradigm, is that ultimately when you immanentize an accusation against life and you become the actuary of that accusation, you're always being judged. All right, so you never get, but you're always being judged constantly. This is what happens when you're looking at the nature of credit, the way how that artifacts are used to identify you, because you can't just be a person. You have to prove your identity, which is absurd. But in the face of what would be God, let's say, well, you're going to start there. You're totally naked as far, and so your judgment is what your spirit. But how can you vivify the spirit if life's always given as a compensation? You don't question the bias genie that's been set for your aspirations, and you don't know where you are. I mean, this is literally one of the things. So once again, so how can you relate all that mythologizing and all those, like impressionistic kind of understanding of, say, history, and work it back to practicalities of where we are now? You're a credit instrument, you're a demand center. You have to understand the way how you become an interchangeable economic unit. If you don't understand that, then you will never potentialize the opportunity cost, and so therefore ultimately make redundant the asset that you are, that is necessary to monetize your existence. And so therefore the redemption will change. It will completely shift. It won't be predicated upon you as an asset. You ultimately will turn into a liability. And I think that's kind of, we're getting an inkling of that now, but it's not to the degree that we need to, because people aren't questioning you, that you're the principal product. You do it to yourself. Know how you do it. If you don't question that, you're never going to fucking know. You're never going to find an out. And there is one.